in Atlantic City and is a picture editor and co-author of Atlantic City, 125 Years of Ocean Madness, Live and Be Well, a celebration of Yiddish culture in America, Cuba Style, graphics from the golden age of design, Times Square Style as well. She is also co-founder of the Atlantic City Historical Museum and a historical consultant to HBO's Boardwalk Empire. Vicki Gold-Levy's long-term collaboration with Wendell White began in 1989, when Wendell was recommended to assist with photographs for the Atlantic City Historical Museum. Their partnership resulted in Vicki establishing the Al Gold Memorial Purchase Award, given annually to 2 photography students, and she continues to support the arts with this lecture series named in honor of her father. So please join me in welcoming Vicki Gold.
So much for that lovely introduction. I am so thrilled to see so many people attending here. I know Wendell White is the big draw because he's such a great guy, but I can tell you this, that my father would be so thrilled because he taught a lot of young photographers photography, and he always liked working with young people, so he would be really thrilled that we do a lecture series in his honor and give out the awards. I also want to mention today, before I start the show, that my father's son, Mark Gold, is here with his wife, Wendell Gold, and my sister, Michelle Gold Johnson, is here. If they could stand up and everybody can see us. Okay, let me see, I have to see if this works. Okay. Oh, I probably have to turn it wrong way. There we go. Okay, so you heard about my father's background. My father actually came to Atlantic City because he had typhoid fever. Atlantic City's waters were renowned for helping your health, etc., etc. And while he was here, he had a job at the Tramer Hotel, which used to be on the boardwalk at Indiana Avenue, and he worked for a stock company, and he moved the stocks on the board in charcoal. And but while he was here, they used to have big fighters who did a lot of training in Bader Field for big fights. I mean, really all the top fighters trained here, and he would always go out there and watch them train, and he got trained with the photographers, and that's where he decided he wanted to become a photographer. And so he started very early in 1921, and my talk today is about him being what he started out to be, a boardwalk photographer. That means, you know, he roamed the boardwalk and he took pictures of people, and it was like souvenir photography, and eventually he went to work for the Boardwalk Illustrated News, which was the big magazine. It was like our version of Life magazine. And you know, that's a big box camera he's carrying there. So these are some examples of the boardwalk photography that he did. I know he took these pictures because that's his 2 sisters. So I know he took those pictures. I don't know that he took these, but these would be similar to what he may have taken, just to show you that this was people in the rolling chairs, people walking down the boardwalk, and then he would take an order for the picture. It's not like today, you can digitally produce it in a couple of minutes. You know, you have to take an order and then send it to you, and hope you got paid. Sometimes you didn't. Anyhow, I know he took this one too because that little girl on the right is me. It's a typical example of how his photography was very exuberant. Now, in Atlantic City, all along the boardwalk, there were all these photo studios. And these photo studios all competed for originality and some color, and some did backgrounds. I don't know which photo studio this is exactly, but this would be all hand-colored. And this is another one where they would have a rolling chair placed there, and you know, you would sit in the rolling chair. Sometimes they had a background. And also, I really liked collecting the photographs where the original frames are there. This was, I think, the Palace. No, this is. I'm trying to see the Walk Studios. Walk Studios were here in Philadelphia, and very ornate framing job that was hand painted. Another one with the 2 little girls in their very cumbersome bathing suits. And here is an example. This was the Dietrich studio, and if any of you watched Boardwalk Empire, did any of you watch that here? Okay, so you know in the first season, because I was the historical consultant to that show along with Heather Perez, who's in the audience from the Atlantic City Library, they did that whole season was about Dietrich. There's a whole story about the photographer in Dietrich studio. And here, this was a sort of trick photograph where a guy would sit there and he would be reflected in the mirror, and then that would be, the studios were all competitive, so they tried to come up with new things. Now, my father wasn't adverse to having getting in the action. This is my dad on one of those. This is probably the Central Pier or Steel Pier, and he had a good sense of humor, as you can see here. It was a lot of fun to take the pictures in the bars, fake bars, so this was one example, and here is Stinky's Bar, probably on Steel Pier, where people would take their picture and show they were having a good holiday. Now, very famous, one of the most famous boardwalk photography studios was the Little Cottage, and they were really renowned for two things: their honeymoon pictures. And so many people came here and they took them to the honeymoon cottage. And also they had this fake horse and carriage. And I have so many of these pictures where families would come down and take this picture. And then a lot of conventioneers would come down, or different organizations. And that's a backdrop. That's not really the boardwalk. That's a photo backdrop of Atlantic City. And they were down here, I think, for a music union convention. And then this idea kind of morphed into the nightclubs. My dad had photography concessions at both the 500 Club. This was originally called the 500 Cafe. Right. And you would be there, and a woman would come around, usually an attractive woman, and get your picture. And while you watch the show, he'd be in the back developing. And then Hackney's was another place that he did it, so the souvenir photo took another element. And then finally, all this sort of amusing photography had a way of, when he started to really photograph for the city, it started to become things that were amusing in themselves in the actual picture. This was a mechanical elephant that was on Steel Pier. This was in 1954 in Convention Hall. They celebrated the 100th anniversary of Atlantic City, and here's another sort of amusement. So this was an example of the way the photography started and morphed into more eccentric kind of photography. So that's an example of what my dad did, and I thank you very much. And I want to say something else. I want to thank our guest speaker today, who's very special to me, Wendell White. He's been my mentor, my colleague, and most importantly, my friend. And we've been working together, as Dean told you, since 1989. And I think his sense of photography, his sense of community, his sense of art is so distinguished. That's why he's a distinguished professor. And I'm just honored that he's our speaker today.
Well, it's now my job to introduce our speaker today, Wendell White, Distinguished Professor of Art at Stockton University. His talk will be Looking Black, 25 Years of Photography Projects. I want to begin by saying that Wendell is the fourth guest lecturer in this series. He follows in the footsteps of highly profiled professionals in the arts, Michael Bzdak, Director of Collections for Johnson & Johnson, International Curator Lance Fung, and renowned photographer Larry Fink. Wendell White himself was born in Newark, New Jersey, and grew up in New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. He was awarded a BFA in photography from the School of Visual Arts in New York and an MFA in photography from the University of Texas at Austin. White is currently the Distinguished Professor of Art at Stockton. He has received various awards and fellowships, including a John Simon Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship in Photography, 3 artist fellowships from the New Jersey State Council for the Arts, a photography grant from the Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in Fine Arts, and a photography fellowship from Enfoco, Inc. His work is represented in museums, libraries, corporate, and private collections. Wendell's work is included in numerous publications, including 2 books about his work, Manifest, published in 2014 by Chroma, and Small Towns, Black Lives, published in 2003 by the Noyes Museum of Art. Wendell has served on the board of directors for the Society of Photographic Education, the Atlantic City Historical Museum, New Jersey Black Culture and Heritage Foundation, and the New Jersey Council for the Humanities. For more than 25 years, he's been engaged with a series of photographic projects addressing the African-American historical narrative. The projects include portraits, landscapes, and objects of material culture. This presentation will include works from Small Towns, Black Lives, Village of Peace, an African-American community in Israel, Schools for the Colored, 7 Steps to Freedom, and his most recent volume, Manifest. While New Jersey locations appear significantly in many of the projects, these projects also include images made in various parts of the U.S. and in Israel. And I'm also happy to say that I actually own a photograph from the Manifest series that I value enormously. So with that, I would like to introduce you to our speaker today, Wendell White.
Thank you. I'm live. While we fiddle around, like we'll probably do this for the next half an hour or so, with the equipment, one sort of unconnected thing that we should get a chance to do and celebrate is is there anybody that can bring up the light a little bit in the house? No, a little bit? No, I can't? Oh, you're here. Okay, you're not there. Anyway, you can imagine if I'm going to get them to stand up. Where's John and Colleen? Get them to stand up for a little bit there. Stand up again. I know it's tonight. Let's congratulate them. They just got married as well.
Congratulations.
All right.
Thank you.
Barry. Now for the next half an hour we'll do this. Well, we're doing this a little bit. I do want to also mention how much the relationship that I've had with Vicki as well as with Stockton University. Very sophisticated stuff here. I just saw the Steve Johnson movie this weekend, so consequently, facing these problems. What's more? While we get that straightened out, in addition to the projects that we've worked on with the Atlantic City Historical Museum between Vicki and I, the other aspect of that relationship has been that we've had a number of conversations that range, and this is one of the things that will be important about some of the things that I want to talk to you today about, is that we have had a great relationship in which, in addition to thinking about photographs and photographs in Atlantic City and putting together exhibitions for Atlantic City in that way, the other aspect of this has been that we've genuinely been able to think about issues of culture and race and identity as it applies to the historical photographs that were exhibited. It's too dark for you to even take out something and read right now.
can see now one of the issues with the digital age and not just being able to take out a photograph and show it to someone, even in presentations such as this. The electronics or the technical end of it is causing issues.
And the
So
one
the
speaking
crossover
softly
for
was
music
just being broadcast out.
switching into photography to digital photography. These are some of the issues that folks have had.
I'm not all stretched out. So what I want to do is get a chance, and this is something I've occasionally had an opportunity to talk about, but mostly when I have opportunities to talk about my work, they tend to be singular projects. So this was a great opportunity. Hey Beth, how are you? How you doing? This is a great opportunity to have the chance to try to bring a number of these different projects together, and it's actually been a really nice opportunity for me to think about how I want to talk about the various kinds of projects and how they interrelate. And in fact, you know, not surprisingly, this morning I was still rearranging the pictures and thinking of new arrangements as to how they would go together. So one of the things that I've done here is that I've tried to, I've taken very different kinds of groupings and arrangements within the individual bodies of work than normally have been the way that they've been thought about and arranged in different exhibitions and publications, etc. So hopefully that will be in some way useful and revealing as we begin to sort of look at these different projects. What I hope to do is to try and have a hopefully casual and informal talk, but at the same time there are important text pieces that have been part of the research, that have been part of the development of these projects, and along the way I will take some time to sort of read little passages of my own thoughts that help to sort of clarify my thoughts, and at the same time I also have text passages by others that have come up during my research and that have deeply influenced the work that I've been doing. So one of the things that I've done here with the Small Towns Black Lives Project is to think about dividing it in these new ways, and one of the ways is to first take a look at the way in which people played a prominent role in the project. Normally this project is thought about in terms of the various communities. So the project photographs or documents the lives of people and the communities and the architecture in 13 different communities around historically African-American communities around South Jersey. But today we're sort of, you know, breaking apart the communities and thinking about the different themes that emerge in the book, independent of the specific communities. I'll start with a short passage that just sort of lays some groundwork. In the fall, and so what I'll also do is I'm going to let these run on an automatic timer. So when I get to the pictures, which I'm going to do right now, they'll run on an automatic timer. You may not always, especially in this group, there's a good amount of text. You can see all this stuff on my website, so don't, you know, worry. In the fall of 1986, I accepted a position on the faculty at Richard Stockton College of New Jersey, Stockton State College at the time, now Stockton University. We'll see how we go in the future. Just before moving, it would come up with another new name, just before moving to New Jersey, a conversation with Deborah Willis, at the time the curator for the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in New York, made me aware of an African-American community known as Whitesboro, New Jersey. During the summer of 1989, I drove to Whitesboro, photographed the town, and returned several times over the next few months. These photographs, which would become the Small Towns Black Lives Project, began as a modest attempt to depict daily events and activities in a small, historically African-American community near the southernmost tip of New Jersey. In Whitesboro, I photographed and held extended conversations with many of the residents, mostly senior members of the community. Mrs. Gladys Spaulding was one of the first to invite me into her home, where she spent several hours answering my questions about the history of the settlement. Her home was located just a few hundred yards from the Whitesboro Head Start Program Center. Mrs. Spaulding described the history of the building and its origins as a one-room school, expanded from the original structure into a multi-room building for the African-American students in Whitesboro. Her description of the school included high praise for the school's black teachers, as well as concern for the difficulties students faced as they moved through the segregated primary school to the predominantly white high school. And I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. And so these are, again, various themes that emerged during the project. These are various places of worship, and I'm going to come back to talking, we were just looking at a synagogue on Moss Mill Road, and we'll come back and talk about how that then later influenced other work that I did. But except for that first one, the rest of these are primarily churches, and which would be the kind of normal faith-based organization in historically African-American communities. There were also these other spaces that were interesting to me, not just homes, but also the landscape. And this became, in fact, one of the earliest ways in which I began thinking about the landscape in relationship to black culture and the landscape as a sort of repository of culture and history, and that those spaces were not just neutral geographic spaces that had characteristics based on where they're located on the planet, but they're also spaces that have to do with the kinds of people that inhabit those spaces. This section is entitled The Cemetery, and it's not just one cemetery, it's multiple cemeteries, and cemeteries, as in all communities and places of worship, and all of these things are common to all communities, but in particular, the title, The Cemetery, was important because the first website that I produced in 1995, that was my attempt to start sharing this information online with people and sharing some of the research material that I was gathering online with people, was entitled The Cemetery because it was about a specific cemetery very close to the college. This is one of the headstones, another one that was located is located in that cemetery, which is essentially almost just walking distance. It's off of Moss Mill Road, just behind the college. Many of you have probably passed it. It's right on the triangle, sort of going to Smithville or going towards Port Republic. And it was a place that there wasn't much information about at the time, and slowly I gathered some of that information. And so what we saw there in particular was the way in which, and we'll come back to this, the way in which the Civil War played out in a remarkable way in southern New Jersey. We saw one, the largest one is in Lawnside, an entire section of United States Colored Troops headstones, and all throughout the region, many of the headstones and many of the cemeteries that are older, especially in the southern part of the state, have connections to the Civil War. And we'll get, as I said, I'll get back to that. I want to complete what I was starting to say about Mrs. Spaulding and the school experience. She defined the shifting relationship between black students and white high school teachers who perceived them as interlopers or simply not worth the effort given the social constraints on African American achievement at the time. Mrs. Spaulding died about 1 month after our conversation. However, years later, this encounter would become the foundation of my interest in the role of the schoolhouse as one of the most enduring spaces for the definition of race and class identity in the American landscape. And we'll see some schools that are, again, still from the Small Towns Black Lives Project. So this is still before I conceived of, and this is the portrait taken inside a school in Swedesboro, New Jersey. Here's the outside of that very same building where the portrait was taken. But this is well before I even really thought about how important this might be or what it might evolve into at some other point in time. The Franklin Street School in Cape May. And again, as I went from place to place, I was also struck by the degree to which many of of the different communities had been underrepresented and felt neglected, and so there were all of these ways in which the community was providing me access, letting me go into abandoned buildings and finding, ways to make access, people letting me take their portraits. As you saw in the beginning, most of the portraits were taken in people's homes. Again, overall, a remarkable experience. So, as I mentioned to you earlier, I talked about the synagogue as one of the places of worship in the African American community. And that portrait was a portrait that I made and was part of the book, and along with a number of photographs of homes, part of the book, Small Towns, Black Lives, and another aspect of work that had not yet matured in terms of my thinking, only an encounter that I had experienced. And as part of the wonderful range of interdisciplinary activities that take place at the college, I had the opportunity, through conversations with different people, one of whom is sitting right here, Dr. Beverly Vaughn, who had traveled before me as part of a group of faculty to a community in Israel, and she came back and she said, there's an African American town, there's a black town in southern Israel, you might be interested in it. And all of the people are from the United States, except of course the people that were born there, younger people. So the following year, I participated in that travel and got an opportunity to visit this community and get a chance to understand something about the nature of a set of ideas that are, in a sense, really remarkable in terms of how they are connected to the notion of what is African American identity, what is Israeli identity, what is Jewish identity. And this is a small town, in a sense, a small settlement, almost identical to the kinds of settlements that I was photographing. One of the things to be clear about here is that only Lawnside, New Jersey is the only incorporated, independently incorporated town that I photographed in South Jersey. When I call them black towns, I am really referring to settlements, areas where people live together, but not necessarily, independent municipalities. And so the same thing is true here. This is a settlement, and I won't, go through the whole long history of it. It's a wonderful, fascinating history about how these people got to this particular community, but it's a settlement, again, within a larger municipality, the municipality of Dimona. And remarkably, they also have a school. And not remarkable to them, but remarkable to me because, again, these various connections were coming together. I was at once sort of seeing and connecting with an African American community in a remote location, a diaspora community in which people, in a sense, and this is part of the narrative of that community, which is remarkable, is the belief that Africans taken into slavery, brought into the United States, were part of one of the tribes of Israel, and so in the 1960s they returned to Israel, actually through Africa, by living first in Western Africa, in Liberia, and then moving into Israel. And we could spend the whole afternoon talking about that community and the complications and implications of an African American community in a place like Israel. And I should note that for the African Hebrew Israelites who have been here, and we had an exhibition and a panel discussion, the ones that live in Israel do identify themselves as Israelis. They are permanent residents of Israel, but the nature of their culture is still deeply African American. So I've touched on schools in a couple of different places, and so this then gradually led me to this idea of thinking about the schoolhouse as a place of significance in the landscape, as I mentioned earlier when I was referring to the conversations that I had with Mrs. Spaulding. This project And actually started at that location because of a black town that had to maintain a small school for a tiny white population that existed within that town. It's the only example that I've ever come across in looking at different communities throughout the United States. But all of this came together by beginning to think about and going back and reading a particular passage from W.E.B. Du Bois. And it's from The Souls of Black Folks, Our Spiritual Strivings. Du Bois writes, "And yet being the problem is a strange experience, particularly even for one who has never been anything else, save perhaps in boyhood and in Europe. It is in the early days of rollicking boyhood that the revelation first burst upon one, all in a day, as it were. I remember well when the shadow swept across me. I was a little thing, way up in the hills of New England, where the dark Housatonic winds between the Hoosac and the Taganik to the sea. In the wee wooden schoolhouse, something put it into the boys and girls' heads to buy gorgeous visiting cards, 10 cents a package, and exchange them. The exchange was merry till one girl, a newcomer, refused my card, refused it peremptorily with a glance. Then it dawned on me, with a certain suddenness, that I was different from the others, or like mayhap, in heart and life and longing, but shut out from their world by a vast veil. I had thereafter no desire to tear down that veil, to creep through. I held all beyond it in common contempt, and lived above it in a region of blue sky and great wandering shadows." So the importance of that is that going back to that and thinking about that particular passage is what led to the stylistic representation here that previous photograph. Throughout the group, there are placeholders, buildings that are no longer there, so I'll make a silhouette for them. But the general approach has been to create a veil that separates the schoolhouse from its surrounding landscape. And the buildings that are in this project range from, and the first one was in Brooklyn, Illinois, so it was about as close as you could get to the Mississippi River. And the last ones will be in New Jersey. So it goes Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey are where all of the different schools are located. These are remarkably complex spaces. And we're looking at New Jersey structures right now. And I just want to wait until we get to it's going to come up next. That's Atlantic City, Indiana Avenue School. And then this school, the Manual Training and Industrial School for Colored Youth in Bordentown. And so one of the things that's remarkable, this is a remarkable structure, a remarkable building. It's actually part of a campus, a 90-acre campus with approximately a dozen buildings on it. It operated all the way up until 1955, even though New Jersey had already, in 1947 version of the state constitution, outlawed segregation. And so they dropped in 47 or 48 the name, the part of the name that said for colored youth. But by that time, and this goes back to the whole notion of black spaces, by that time it had been so established as a black space that, as my understanding of the history of the school, not more than 1 or 2 whites ever attempted to attend the school, and nobody completed the full course because it just was already identified and defined as a black space in that way. And that boundary was insurmountable for most people. And so, even when the formality of the restriction was lifted. And then what becomes remarkable is that it continues to operate until 1955, and it's one of the only, or the only, it's the only state-run, this is a state-run institution. It's a boarding school, it's a remarkable school. There's a wonderful documentary film that talks about this. They have an active alumni association. It's a remarkable group that's involved in trying to, preserve the narrative of the school. But it's the only state-run segregated boarding school, state-run segregated boarding school in the northern state. It's run here, is here in New Jersey. So the complexity of these schools, and this is, and it's important to understand, this is a beloved school to the people that went to the school, and it was a remarkable school. It started, and even though it's called industrial training and manual training and industrial, there was a classical education track inside the school. It did not indicate that because it was politically unsustainable to indicate that you were going to provide a classical education for African Americans in terms of the state funding. So a kind of vocational school, but many students went on to college because of courses in advanced mathematics and courses in languages and Latin and all of this sort of education that you would expect in the classical education in the early 20th century, in the first part of the 20th century. And so it was a subversive place as well. One other piece of writing has an impact for me in relationship to this, and it's by the writer Bell Hooks. And she says this about another black school. Almost all of our teachers at Booker T. Washington were black women. They were committed to nurturing intellect so that we would become scholars, thinkers, and cultural workers, black folks who used their minds. We learned early that our devotion to learning, to the life of the mind, was a counter-hegemonic act, a fundamental way to resist every strategy of white racist colonialism. Though they did not define or articulate these practices in theoretical terms, my teachers were enacting a revolutionary pedagogy of resistance that was profoundly anti-colonial. Within these segregated schools, black children were deemed exceptional, gifted, were given special care. Now that's an important note in relationship to, if you recall, what Mrs. Spalding talked about in terms of the difficulty of black children going into the high school. And in New Jersey, this Bordentown school was the only high school, as far as I know, that existed into the 20th century. Basically, we only had segregated primary schools, and then if students would go on in school, if they went on in school, they would go to an integrated high school. Teachers worked with and for us to ensure that we would fulfill our intellectual destiny, and by so doing, uplift the race. My teachers were on a mission. When we entered racist, desegregated white schools, we left the world where teachers believed that to educate black children rightly would require a political commitment. Now, we were mainly taught by white teachers whose lessons reinforced racist stereotypes. For black children, education was no longer about the practice of freedom. She goes on a little bit later in that chapter to say she wouldn't go back to a segregated school. So that's an important thing to remember about that as a takeaway. She doesn't see going back to a segregated school as a solution to the problem, but she points out, she forefronts in this, the notion that desegregation happened in our society without any plan, basically. There was no means by which it would be understood how people would be accepted, how people would work through it. This becomes a remarkably important part of things that I'm concerned with as a photographer and as somebody who is, producing work that has a specific social concern to it. 7 Steps to Freedom was actually a commission. It's actually a fairly short project. Salem County decided that they wanted to create a walking tour of historic sites within the county, but it's primarily, most of the sites are right in Salem City. Some of them are outside towards Fort Ellsworth, and one is up towards Woodstown. So all of these sites, and there are 7 of them, are connected and they've had scripts written and actors perform. And Salem is a remarkable place because, first of all, it's important to know that Salem is older than Philadelphia. But one of the things that's remarkable to me about Salem is that people were enslaved on one side of the street at a given moment in history, and at the same moment in history, there were activists, abolitionist activists, helping to move runaway slaves to the Underground Railroad, essentially on the other side of the street. I mean, if you look at the Colonel Johnson house, and if you look at the house for the Goodwin sisters, I mean, you know, it takes you 2 seconds to walk from one to the other, and opposite ends of the political spectrum are unfolding in those two locations. There's just a few images, but I have a piece that I would like to read in connection to this idea. From a book by Mark Elliott. The title of the book is Colorblind Justice, which is an interesting issue anyway that has recently come up. But I will just read this one passage about Albion, and the book is a biography of the attorney and Civil War veteran, and did a number of different things. His name was Albion Tourget. Tourget was particularly well known as the attorney for the plaintiffs in Plessy v. Ferguson, which, in losing that case, he unwittingly ushered in segregation. So before we go on to manifest, in the spring of 1902, a package arrived at the United States Consulate in Bordeaux, France, containing a complimentary copy of The Leopard Spots, a romance of the white man's burden by Thomas Dixon Jr. Walter Hines Page, the prominent publisher who had personally arranged for the publication of The Leopard Spots at Doubleday, Page and Company, probably sent the volume, believing that the American consul in Bordeaux would find the subject matter of great interest. If so, Page was not alone in this assumption. More copies of Dixon's first novel were sent to Albion Tourget by friends and foes alike. Responding in a 38-page typewritten letter composed in short stints over several weeks, he gave full expression to his feelings. The extraordinary letter reveals, now this is happening after this is sort of the decline of his career. This is after the Plessy v. Ferguson case, which was 1898. So he's already lost that case, and his hopes for what basically he would hope for was a kind of racial equality in America. The extraordinary letter reveals the depths of Tourget's ideological distance from both Dixon, the Southern extremist, and Northern liberals. The long letter gave Tourget an opportunity to reflect upon the crusade for social justice to which he had devoted his career. By 1902, he became a voice in the wilderness, a voice from the political wilderness, and no one knew it better than himself. He had once believed that the Civil War had set this country upon a course of humanitarian enlightenment and moral progress. Recalling the idealism of his war days, he remembered his joy at the mere call to the overthrow of slavery, which had removed that stain of injustice and oppression on his country. Emancipation, he had believed, had made the United States truly the flower of liberty, security, and equal rights for all. But somehow the true spirit of the crusade against slavery had been afterwards forgotten. We have made the name of slavery an anathema, he told Johnson, but we have sanctified the most degrading and debasing element, the subjugation of one race to the will of another. So all of these things, and I'm saying a lot, I'm happy, afterwards, we'll have a question and answer period, and I'll be really happy to, answer questions about how I make pictures and everything. But for me, the most important thing is that pictures it's like being a writer and, wanting to talk about craft. I am really interested in content. I'm really interested in, as an artist, what sort of ideas can I express? What ideas lend themselves to the photographic image? What kinds of pictures should be used and how to use them? And so far, hopefully, I've started to reveal to you a series of ways, a series of strategies in which I've tried to find and unravel these different ideas and express these ideas. Partly because I believe we are always haunted and possessed, in a sense, by the past in a way that's very hard to come to terms with. If you have a ghost living in your house and you can't get rid of it, after a while you just sort of go, well, okay, there's a ghost in my house. What could I do? So I've, in a sense, moved from